The auction block in Copper Creek had seen many shameful sales, but none quite like this. A weathered Apache warrior named Silent Wolf stood at the edge of the crowd, watching as men bid on a pale, trembling keel who couldn't be more than 8 years old. Her dress was torn, her eyes hollow with hunger and fear. When the bidding reached $20, Silent Wolf stepped forward with his entire savings, $43 earned from months of backbreaking work at the mines. The girl said nothing as he led her away from the jeering crowd. Neither did he. What words could explain an act that defied everything his warrior's heart had been taught about survival? That night, as she slept on a blanket in his humble cabin, Silent Wolf wondered if he had saved her or doomed them both. But what the mysterious stranger would reveal at dawn would change everything Silent Wolf believed about his past. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. 5 years had passed since Silent Wolf last felt the sacred earth of his ancestral lands beneath his feet. 5 years since the elders had spoken the words that severed him from everything he had ever known. You are no longer Apache. You are no longer our son. The empty leather pouch that hung from his belt served as a constant reminder of that day. Once it had held the sacred pigments, red ochre from the sacred mountains, white clay blessed by the medicine men, charcoal from fires that had burned for generations, war paint that marked him as a warrior of the Cherikawa, a protector of his people. Now it hung empty, as hollow as the place in his chest where his identity used to live. He sat on the rough wooden chair outside his cabin, watching the girl sleep through the open doorway. In the flickering candlelight, she looked even more fragile than she had on the auction block. Her thin shoulders rose and fell with each breath, and occasionally she would whimper in her sleep, lost in dreams he could only imagine. The mines had been brutal work, but it was the only employment available to a man with his skin and his past. Each day, he descended into the suffocating darkness, his Apache eyes trained to read the subtle signs of the desert, now scanning for veins of silver in the candlelit tunnels. His hands, once steady enough to draw a bowstring in absolute silence, now gripped picks and shovels until his palms bled and calloused over. But even in exile, even working alongside men who called him savage when they thought he couldn't hear, Silent Wolf had maintained the disciplines his grandfather taught him. Each morning before dawn, he performed the ancient exercises that kept his body strong and his mind sharp. He practiced tracking in the wilderness around Copper Creek, reading the stories written in disturbed earth and broken twigs. He could still move through the forest without making a sound, still sensed danger on the wind like a ghost from the old days. The white men who worked beside him in the mines saw only what they expected to see, a broken Indian, grateful for whatever scraps their world might offer. They didn't notice how he catalogued their weaknesses, their habits, their fear. They didn't realize that while they spoke carelessly around him, he was learning their language, their customs, their ways of thinking. Knowledge was a weapon. His grandfather had taught him, and a wise warrior gathered weapons wherever he could find them. Tonight, watching over this strange, silent child, Silent Wolf found himself thinking about protection in ways he hadn't considered for years. During his time with the tribe, protection had meant warfare, riding hard against enemies, striking fast and disappearing into the landscape like smoke. But this girl needed a different kind of protection. She needed patience, gentleness, the kind of steady presence that could heal wounds the eye couldn't see. He had seen that look before, in the eyes of Apache children who had survived cavalry raids, the hollow stare that came after witnessing things no child should ever see. The way they flinched at sudden movements, how they startled at loud voices. This girl bore those same scars, written in the language of fear, across her young face. What had driven him to bid his life savings for her? Even now, hours later, he couldn't fully explain the impulse. Perhaps it was the memory of his sister's daughter, killed in a cavalry attack when she was about this girl's age. Perhaps it was simply that in her terrified eyes he had seen something of himself, lost, alone, cast adrift in a world that seemed determined to destroy anything pure and innocent. The practical voice in his head reminded him of the problems this decision would create. A lone Apache man, caring for a white child in a frontier town where suspicion and hatred ran as deep as the mine shafts. It was a recipe for trouble that could get them both killed. But another voice, one that sounded remarkably like his grandfather's, whispered that sometimes a man's greatest test came not in battle, but in choosing to protect the defenseless when no one was watching. As the night wore on, Silent Wolf found himself studying the girl's face in the candlelight, searching for clues to her story. Where had she come from? Who had cared for her before she ended up on that auction block? And why did he feel, deep in his bones, that her fate was somehow connected to his own? Dawn was still hours away, but already he could sense that tomorrow would bring answers to questions he hadn't even known to ask. The girl clutched the wooden doll so tightly that her knuckles had turned white. It was a crude thing, carved from what looked like pine, with features worn smooth by countless small hands. One of the arms had been broken and carefully mended with thin wire, and the painted face had faded to little more than suggestion, but she held it like it contained all the treasures of the world. Silent Wolf had tried 3 times since sunrise to coax her to eat the simple breakfast he'd prepared: cornmeal mush, sweetened with the last of his honey, and strips of dried venison he'd been saving for winter. Each time he approached with the tin plate, she would shrink back against the cabin wall, pressing the doll closer to her chest, her eyes wide with the kind of fear that came from experience rather than imagination. He had seen this before, in Apache children who had survived cavalry raids, the way they would refuse food from strangers, even when hunger gnawed at their bellies. Trust, once shattered, did not heal quickly or easily. It had to be rebuilt one careful gesture at a time, like constructing a shelter from stones, each piece placed with deliberate patience, knowing that one wrong move could bring the whole structure tumbling down. So Silent Wolf did what his grandfather had taught him about dealing with wounded creatures. He made himself small and unthreatening. He moved slowly, telegraphing his intention. He spoke in the soft, rhythmic tones that Apache mothers used to calm frightened children, even though he knew she couldn't understand his words. The tone carried its own meaning, older than language. When she flinched at the sound of his footsteps on the wooden floor, he began walking on the balls of his feet, the way he moved when stalking deer. When she startled at the scrape of his chair, he cushioned it with a folded blanket. Gradually her shoulders began to relax, though she never let go of the doll. The wooden toy told its own story to eyes trained to read such things. The craftsmanship spoke of someone who cared enough to take time with the details: tiny fingers carved with surprising precision, a dress that had once been painted blue. The careful repair of the broken arm suggested it had been treasured, mended by hands that understood its importance to a small heart. But there were other signs too. Dark stains on the doll's dress that could have been dirt or could have been something else. A chip in the wooden head that looked fresh, as if it had been damaged recently, and roughly, and the way the girl held it, not with the casual affection of a child at play, but with the desperate grip of someone clinging to the last piece of a shattered world. Silent Wolf had learned patience in the hardest school imaginable. Hours spent motionless in hunting blinds, waiting for the perfect shot, days tracking wounded prey across trackless desert, following signs so faint that other men would have given up after the first mile. But this was a different kind of patience, requiring not just stillness of body, but gentleness of spirit. By midday he had managed to set the plate of food on the floor halfway between them. The girl watched him with the intensity of a cornered animal, but she didn't flee. When he retreated to his chair and began working on mending a broken bridle, keeping his hands busy with harmless activity, she eventually crept forward and took a small piece of the venison. She ate like someone who had learned not to trust that food would be available tomorrow. Quick, efficient bites, her eyes never leaving his face. The doll remained clutched in her left arm throughout the meal, as essential as breathing. Silent Wolf found himself wondering about the person who had carved that doll, a father perhaps, whittling away winter evenings to create something that would bring his daughter joy. Or maybe a mother, using skills learned from her own childhood to fashion a companion for lonely hours. Whoever it was, they had put love into that simple piece of wood, and somehow that love had survived whatever violence had torn this child from her home. As the afternoon wore on, the girl's posture began to soften. She still wouldn't speak, still flinched at sudden movements, but she no longer pressed herself against the wall as if trying to disappear into the timber. Progress, Silent Wolf thought. Tiny, almost invisible progress, but progress nonetheless. The sun was setting when she finally made a sound, not words, but a soft humming, barely audible. A lullaby, perhaps, or maybe just a melody that brought comfort to a frightened heart. She sang it to the wooden doll, and in that moment, Silent Wolf glimpsed the child she had been before the world had taught her to be afraid. The knock came at dawn, 3 measured raps that carried the authority of someone accustomed to having doors opened for him. Silent Wolf had been awake for an hour already, sitting vigil as he had through the night, watching the girl sleep and listening to the sounds of the awakening town. But this sound was different, purposeful, inevitable, like the approach of a storm that had been building on the horizon for days. The man who stood on his threshold wore clothes that spoke of wealth and position. His black wool coat showed no signs of trail dust. His boots were polished to a mirror shine, and gold watch chain glinted across his vest. He was perhaps 40 years old, with the kind of pale, soft hands that had never known calluses, and eyes the color of winter sky. But it was the silver pocket watch he held that caught Silent Wolf's attention, an ornate piece engraved with symbols that seemed to dance in the morning light. "Silent Wolf, I presume," the stranger said, his voice carrying the careful diction of education and breeding. "My name is Charles Whitmore. I believe you have something that belongs to me." Silent Wolf said nothing, but he stepped aside to allow the man entry. The girl was awake now, sitting up on her blanket with the wooden doll pressed against her chest. When she saw the stranger, her reaction was not what Silent Wolf expected. Instead of fear or recognition, her face showed something closer to resignation, as if she had been waiting for this moment and dreading it in equal measure. Charles Whitmore removed his hat and set it carefully on the rough wooden table. The gesture was theatrical, performed with the kind of deliberate courtesy that men of his class used to demonstrate their superiority over their surroundings. But Silent Wolf noticed that his eyes never quite met the girl's, and there was something in his posture that suggested discomfort rather than paternal concern. "I trust Mary has been well cared for," Whitmore said, glancing at the girl with the same detached interest he might show a piece of livestock. "Though I must say, these accommodations are rather primitive." The girl Mary clutched her doll tighter, but made no sound. Silent Wolf could see the tension in her small frame, the way she seemed to be holding her breath. Whatever relationship existed between this man and the child, it was not the simple bond of father and daughter. "I suppose you're wondering why I haven't come to retrieve her sooner," Whitmore continued, opening his pocket watch and checking the time with elaborate ceremony. "The truth is, Mr. Silent Wolf, that Mary's circumstances and those complications have led me to a rather unusual proposition." Silent Wolf remained silent, but his senses were fully alert now. This man's words carried undercurrents of meaning, like a river with dangerous currents flowing beneath a calm surface. The Apache warrior in him recognized the presence of deception, even if he couldn't yet identify its exact nature. "You see," Whitmore said, settling into the cabin's only chair as if he owned it, "I find myself in a position where Mary's immediate return to my household would be inconvenient. There are certain financial arrangements that require my attention, certain debts that must be settled before I can properly provide for her care." The pocket watch seemed to pulse with its own light as Whitmore turned it over in his hands. The engravings were intricate, not just decorative flourishes, but symbols that carried meaning. Silent Wolf's grandfather had taught him to read the sacred symbols of his people, and while these were different, they spoke of power and wealth and secrets that ran deeper than surface appearances. "What I'm proposing," Whitmore continued, "is that you continue to care for Mary for a period of time. I will, of course, provide compensation for her upkeep, and when my affairs are properly arranged, we can discuss more permanent arrangements." Silent Wolf found his voice at last. "What is she to you?" Whitmore's smile was sharp as a blade. "An excellent question, one that has a more complex answer than you might expect." He stood and walked to the window, gazing out at the rough landscape of Copper Creek as if it were a kingdom he was considering purchasing. "Tell me, Mr. Silent Wolf, what do you know about your own parentage? Your mother, perhaps? Her life before she joined the Apache?" The question hit Silent Wolf like a physical blow. His mother had died when he was young, and the circumstances of her arrival among the Apache had always been shrouded in mystery. The elders spoke of her rarely, and always with a strange mixture of respect and sorrow that he had never understood. "I see that strikes a chord," Whitmore observed, turning back from the window. "Good, because Mary's story and your story are connected in ways that neither of you yet understand. And tomorrow, Mr. Silent Wolf, I intend to explain exactly how." Charles Whitmore returned the next morning, carrying a leather satchel and an expression of grim determination. Silent Wolf had spent the night in restless contemplation, his mind churning over the stranger's cryptic words about parentage and connection. Mary had remained silent as always, but he noticed she watched the door with the intensity of someone expecting either salvation or doom. "Before we begin," Whitmore said, settling once again into the wooden chair, "I must ask you to prepare yourself for revelations that will change everything you believe about your place in this world." From the satchel he withdrew a faded daguerreotype in a tarnished silver frame. The image was old, perhaps 20 years or more, showing a young Apache woman standing beside a man in military uniform. The woman's face was proud and beautiful, with high cheekbones and eyes that seemed to hold secrets. The soldier was younger than Whitmore, but bore an unmistakable family resemblance. The same pale eyes, the same aristocratic bearing. Silent Wolf's breath caught in his throat. He had seen that woman's face before, in the few precious memories he retained of his mother. But here she stood, not in Apache dress, but wearing the simple clothing of a frontier settlement, her long black hair bound in a style that spoke of assimilation rather than tradition. "Her name was Evening Star," Whitmore said softly, watching Silent Wolf's reaction. "Though the whites who knew her called her Anna, she was your mother, and this man," he tapped the photograph, "was my brother, Lieutenant James Whitmore of the 7th Cavalry." The words hung in the air like smoke from a distant fire. Silent Wolf stared at the photograph, trying to reconcile the woman he remembered, proud Apache, devoted to the old ways, with this image of someone who had clearly lived between two worlds. James met her during the negotiations at Apache Pass in 1856. Whitmore continued. "She was serving as translator for the Tribal Council, one of the few Apache women who spoke fluent English. He was a young officer, idealistic about bringing peace between the races. What began as a working relationship became something deep." Mary stirred on her blanket, clutching her wooden doll tighter, as if sensing the weight of the revelations unfolding around her. Silent Wolf noticed that her eyes never left the photograph, and there was something in her expression that suggested recognition, though she couldn't have been alive when it was taken. They were married in a ceremony that satisfied neither Apache law nor American custom, Whitmore said. A union that existed in the space between worlds, blessed by neither and condemned by both. For 3 years they tried to build a life together. James resigned his commission, took work as a scout and translator. Anna, Evening Star tried to adapt to white society while maintaining her connections to her people. Silent Wolf's grandfather had told him that his mother came to the Apache as a young woman, that she had been accepted by the tribe because of her wisdom and her skills as a healer. But there had always been gaps in the story, periods of her life that the elders spoke of only in whispers, if at all. The marriage produced 2 children, Whitmore continued, his voice growing softer. You were the first, born in 1842. Your sister followed 2 years later. Sister. The word hit Silent Wolf like a war club to the chest. He had grown up believing himself an only child, his mother's sole legacy to the Apache people. The possibility that he had a sister, someone who shared his blood and his complicated heritage, had never occurred to him. James was killed in a skirmish with raiding Comanche in 1845. Whitmore said, Anna took you and fled back to her people, believing that Apache society would offer better protection for her mixed-blood children than the white settlements. She was probably right, given the attitudes of the time. What happened to my sister? Silent Wolf asked, though part of him already suspected the answer. Whitmore's eyes moved to Mary, who was watching the conversation with the intense focus of someone who understood more than she let on. Your sister remained in white society. I was raised by distant relatives, educated in Eastern schools, married to a respectable merchant. She lived a comfortable life, though she never forgot her Apache heritage or the brother she left behind. Mary is her daughter, Silent Wolf said. It was not a question. Your niece, Whitmore confirmed. The granddaughter of Evening Star, carrying the blood of both worlds just as you do. When her parents died in a cholera epidemic last year, she came into my care as her only living relative on the white side of her family. Silent Wolf looked at Mary with new eyes, seeing in her small face echoes of his mother's features, traces of the Apache blood that flowed through her veins. The wooden doll in her arms suddenly took on new significance, perhaps a gift from her Apache grandmother, a connection to heritage she had never fully understood. Why bring her here? Silent Wolf asked. Why not simply care for her yourself? Whitmore's expression darkened. Because, my dear nephew, I find myself in circumstances that make such care inadvisable. There are debts to be settled, obligations that require my immediate attention. Mary's presence in my household has become a complication I can no longer afford. The first sign of trouble came 3 days after Whitmore's departure, when Mrs. Henderson from the general store crossed to the opposite side of the street, rather than walk past Silent Wolf and Mary on their way to buy supplies. The second sign was the way conversations stopped when they entered the store, replaced by the kind of weighted silence that preceded storms. Sheriff Dalton made the third sign official when he appeared at Silent Wolf's cabin that evening, his tarnished badge catching the last light of sunset. He was a man built like a rain barrel, with small eyes set too close together, and the kind of mustache that ets authority he had never actually earned. Behind him stood 2 deputies, hands resting meaningfully on their gun belts. Wolf, Dalton said, using the shortened name that stripped away any pretense of respect. We need to talk. Silent Wolf stepped outside, closing the cabin door behind him to keep Mary from hearing whatever accusations were about to be leveled. He had learned to read the intentions of white lawmen the same way he read weather patterns, by watching for subtle signs that predicted the coming storm. Folks in town are asking questions, Dalton continued, chewing on a piece of straw that made his words come out slurred and casual. Questions about why a savage is keeping company with a white child. Questions about whether that arrangement is proper. The word proper carried enough venom to poison a well. Silent Wolf had heard it before, used as a weapon by people who wrapped their hatred in the language of moral concern. It was the same word the cavalry officers had used when they spoke of properly civilizing the Apache. The same word the mine supervisors used when they talked about properly managing Indian workers. The girl is my family, Silent Wolf said simply. Dalton laughed, a sound like gravel being stirred with a stick. Family? That's rich. An Apache buck claiming kinship with a white child. What's next? Are you going to tell me you've got legal papers proving adoption? One of the deputies, a younger man with nervous eyes, shifted his weight from foot to foot. Sheriff, maybe we should. Maybe you should keep your mouth shut, Jenkins. Dalton snapped. I'm handling this. Silent Wolf recognized the dynamics at play. Dalton was performing for an audience, demonstrating his authority for deputies who might be questioning his competence. Men like the sheriff were dangerous, not because they were evil, but because they were weak, and weak men often compensated by inflicting cruelty on those who couldn't fight back. The way I see it, Dalton continued, you've got two choices. You can turn the girl over to proper Christian folks who can raise her right, or you can find yourself facing charges that'll put you in territorial prison for a very long time. What charges? Dalton's smile revealed teeth stained brown by tobacco. Oh, I'm sure we can think of something. Kidnapping, maybe. Contributing to the delinquency of a minor. Hell, with the right jury, we might even make a case for something worse. The threat hung in the evening air like gunpowder smoke. Silent Wolf understood that he was facing the kind of systematic injustice that had driven his people from their ancestral lands. Law in places like Copper Creek was whatever men like Dalton decided it should be, especially when it came to dealing with Indians who stepped outside the boundaries whites had drawn for them. The Reverend Morrison and his wife have agreed to take the child, Dalton said. Good Christian people who'll see she gets proper schooling and moral instruction. Much better than living in a shack with a heathen who can't even speak proper English. Silent Wolf thought about the Reverend Morrison, a thin-faced man who preached about salvation while treating his horses better than he treated the Apache workers he occasionally hired for odd jobs. The idea of Mary in that household, her spirit slowly crushed under the weight of righteousness and racial superiority, filled him with a cold rage that took considerable effort to control. And if I refuse, then we'll be back tomorrow with warrants and enough men to make sure you don't cause trouble. Either way, the child comes with us. The only question is whether you're still breathing when we leave. Jenkins looked uncomfortable with the casual talk of violence, but he said nothing. The third deputy, an older man with scars on his knuckles, seemed to be hoping for resistance. These were the kind of men who had made careers out of brutality, who saw Indians as less than human, and treated them accordingly. From inside the cabin came the soft sound of Mary humming to her wooden doll, the same lullaby she sang every evening. The melody was heartbreaking in its innocence, a reminder of everything they were trying to protect and everything they stood to lose. 24 hours, Dalton said, settling his hat more firmly on his head. Think carefully about your decision, Wolf. Some fights aren't worth having. As the three men rode away, Silent Wolf stood in the gathering darkness and considered his options. He could submit to their demands and watch Mary disappear into a system that would strip away everything that made her unique. He'd run, taking her deeper into the wilderness where white law couldn't reach. Or he could fight, knowing that the odds were impossibly long and the consequences of failure would be devastating. Inside the cabin, Mary had stopped humming. Somehow she sensed the danger that surrounded them, even if she didn't understand its exact nature. The broken arrow shaft in Silent Wolf's hand was stained with blood that had long since turned black. He had carried it for 5 years, a reminder of the day his world had collapsed and his identity had been stripped away like bark from a lightning-struck tree. Now, sitting by the dying embers of his fire while Mary slept, he found himself turning it over and over, feeling the splintered wood against his calloused palm. The memory came back with the clarity that trauma always preserved, every detail sharp enough to cut. Canyon Dale, a peaceful Apache camp nestled in the Red Rock Sanctuary, where his people had sheltered for generations. Women grinding corn, children playing in the dust, old men telling stories while they worked on weapons and tools. The kind of ordinary morning that made up the fabric of life, unremarkable, except for the way it felt safe. Silent Wolf had been leading a hunting party, tracking elk through the high country above the canyon. They had been gone for 3 days, following game trails that led deeper into the wilderness, confident that the women and children were protected by the warriors who remained behind. It was the kind of confidence that came from generations of survival, the bone-deep certainty that their sacred places would always offer sanctuary. The smoke had been visible from miles away. When they reached the rim of the canyon, Silent Wolf could see the blackened remains of what had been his home. The tuppers were gone, reduced to charred circles in the earth. Bodies lay scattered like broken dolls, too far away to identify but close enough to count. 27 people, elders, women, children, an entire generation of his family, murdered while he hunted elk in the mountains. The cavalry had come at dawn, Silent Wolf learned later. Captain Morrison, the same Morrison whose son now served as Copper Creek's self-righteous reverend, had led 2 companies of soldiers in what he would later describe in his report as a necessary action against hostile savages who had been raiding settlements. But Silent Wolf knew the truth. These had been peaceful people, living quietly in their traditional homeland, threatening no one. The arrow shaft had belonged to his nephew, a boy of 14, who had died trying to protect his grandmother. Silent Wolf had found him near the center of the camp, his body curved protectively around the old woman's corpse, the broken arrow still clutched in his hand. The shaft had snapped when the boy fell, but he had never let go of it, even in death. Silent Wolf had carried 5 of the other hunters with him that day. Strong young men who had grown up believing that Apache warriors were invincible, that their courage and skill could overcome any enemy. When they saw the massacre below, something fundamental had shattered in all of them. Not just grief. Grief was familiar, a constant companion in a world that demanded constant vigilance. This was something deeper, a realization that all their training, all their warrior traditions, had not been enough to protect the people who mattered most. What happened next would haunt Silent Wolf for the rest of his life. In his rage and anguish, he had led the surviving hunters in pursuit of the cavalry column. They had caught up with the soldiers 2 days later, camped beside a creek in a valley that offered good grazing for their horses. The attack had been swift and brutal, guided by all the tactical knowledge his grandfather had taught him about warfare. But soldiers, Silent Wolf discovered, were not the same as enemy warriors. These men were boys, really, far from home and terrified of the country they found themselves in. When the Apache struck in the pre-dawn darkness, the soldiers had panicked. Some had fought back with desperate courage, but others had simply run. And Silent Wolf, consumed by grief and fury, had pursued them into the darkness and killed them as they fled. 12 soldiers died that night, not in honorable combat, but in the kind of slaughter that mirrored what they had done to the Apache camp. Silent Wolf had become the thing he hated, a killer who struck down the defenseless and called it justice. When he returned to what remained of his people, the elders had looked at him with eyes that held no welcome. They understood what he had done, and they understood why, but they also understood that he had crossed a line that separated warriors from murderers, protectors from destroyers. "You are no longer Apache," the eldest had said. "You have let grief poison your heart and turn you into something we cannot recognize. Until you find a way to heal what has been broken in you, you cannot walk among us." The broken arrow shaft had become his constant companion in the years since, a reminder of the boy who had died protecting his grandmother and the man Silent Wolf had become in the aftermath of that loss. He had thought himself beyond redemption, doomed to carry his shame until death finally released him from it. But watching Mary sleep, seeing the trust in her eyes despite everything she had suffered, Silent Wolf began to wonder if healing might be possible after all. Charles Whitmore returned at midday, but this time he was not alone. Behind him rode 3 hard-faced men who carried themselves with the casual confidence of professional violence. They remained mounted while Whitmore dismounted, their eyes constantly scanning the surrounding landscape as if expecting trouble to emerge from the pine trees at any moment. "I'm afraid our conversation yesterday was incomplete," Whitmore said, producing a folded document from his coat pocket. "There are certain details about Mary's situation that require immediate clarification. Silent Wolf studied the land deed as Whitmore spread it across the rough wooden table. The paper was old but well preserved, covered with legal language and official seals, but even his limited ability to read English was sufficient to understand the essential facts. The document granted ownership of valuable mining claims to whoever could prove legitimate guardianship of Mary Elizabeth Whitmore. Zinc and silver, Whitmore explained, his finger tracing the boundary lines marked on the deed. Mineral rights that my brother acquired shortly before his death. Very valuable mineral rights as it happens, worth perhaps $50,000 at current market prices. The sum was staggering. Silent Wolf had worked in the mines long enough to understand what $50,000 represented. More money than most men would see in several lifetimes, enough to buy entire ranches or establish businesses that would provide security for generations. The complication, Whitmore continued, glancing nervously at his mounted companions, is that my brother's will established a rather unusual provision. The mineral rights can only be inherited by Mary, and only if she is being cared for by someone of Apache blood. James apparently retained certain romantic notions about his late wife's people. Silent Wolf began to understand the true dimensions of the trap that had been set around him. Whitmore needed Mary to remain in Apache care to secure the inheritance, but he also needed to maintain enough control over the situation to eventually claim the wealth for himself. The arrangement at Silent Wolf's cabin had been perfect until other complications had arisen. Unfortunately, Whitmore said, I find myself in immediate need of capital to satisfy certain pressing debts. Debts to gentlemen who are not known for their patience with delinquent accounts. One of the mounted men shifted in his saddle, his hand moving unconsciously toward the gun at his hip. These were not ordinary creditors, Silent Wolf realized. They were the kind of men who collected debts with bullets, when necessary, who viewed violence as simply another business tool. The original plan was quite simple, Whitmore continued. Allow you to care for Mary until she reached majority, at which point certain legal arrangements would ensure that the mineral rights passed to more appropriate hands. But circumstances have forced an acceleration of the timeline. What circumstances? Whitmore's laugh held no humor. Gambling debts primarily. Poor investments in mining ventures that proved less profitable than anticipated. The kind of financial reverses that require immediate correction, regardless of long-term planning. The truth was uglier than Silent Wolf had imagined. Charles Whitmore was not a concerned relative, trying to ensure Mary's welfare. He was a desperate gambler who had mortgaged his niece's future to cover his own mistakes. The girl was valuable to him only as a key to unlock wealth that legally belonged to her. What do you want from me? Silent Wolf asked. Your signature, Whitmore replied, producing a second document. A guardianship agreement that gives me legal authority to make decisions regarding Mary's welfare and her property. In exchange, you'll receive a modest monthly payment and the assurance that Mary will be well cared for. Silent Wolf studied the contract, recognizing it for what it was, a document that would strip Mary of her inheritance, while giving Whitmore the legal authority to claim the mineral rights. The monthly payments were meaningless. Once Whitmore had what he needed, both Silent Wolf and Mary would become inconvenient witnesses to fraud. And if I refused? One of the mounted men answered by drawing his pistol and resting it casually across his saddle horn. The gesture was subtle, but unmistakable. These men had not ridden all this way to accept refusal as an answer. My associates represent certain business interests in Denver, Whitmore said. Interests that have a substantial financial stake in resolving this matter quickly and quietly. I'm afraid that refusal is not really an option. Through the cabin window, Silent Wolf could see Mary sitting on her blanket, humming softly to her wooden doll. She had no idea that her entire future was being negotiated by men who viewed her as nothing more than a means to wealth. The innocence in her quiet song stood in stark contrast to the corruption that surrounded her. How long do I have to consider your offer? Silent Wolf asked. Until sunset, Whitmore replied. My associates have other business to attend to, and they prefer to conclude their transactions before dark. The threat was clear: sign the papers and live as Whitmore's accomplice, or refuse and face the consequences. But Silent Wolf had learned something important during this conversation. He was not the only one trapped in this situation. Whitmore's desperation made him dangerous, but it also made him vulnerable. Desperate men made mistakes, and mistakes created opportunities for those patient enough to recognize them. The spent cartridge lay in the dust outside Henderson's general store, brass gleaming dully in the afternoon sun. Silent Wolf picked it up and rolled it between his fingers, reading the story it told. Fresh firing pin mark, powder residue still faintly visible, ejected recently enough that the metal retained traces of heat. Someone had discharged a weapon in town within the last few hours, and the caliber matched the guns carried by Whitmore's associates. Silent Wolf had been moving through Copper Creek like a ghost, using skills his grandfather had taught him to observe without being observed. The Apache way of gathering intelligence: patient, methodical, nearly invisible. What he had learned in the past hour filled him with cold dread. 3 more men had arrived on the morning stage, their horses tied at the saloon where Whitmore's original companions were drinking. These were not the kind of men who came to frontier towns for legitimate business. They carried themselves with the predatory alertness of professional killers, their eyes constantly moving, hands never far from their weapons. The kind of men who solved problems with violence and asked questions only after the shooting stopped. From his position in the alley behind the barber shop, Silent Wolf had watched them meet with Whitmore in the hotel dining room. The conversation had been brief and conducted in the careful undertones men used when discussing matters that could not afford witnesses. But Silent Wolf had learned to read lips during his time in the mines, a skill that proved useful when bosses discussed Indian workers as if they were deaf. The words he had seen formed on their lips chilled him to the bone. Kill the Apache, make it look like an accident. The girl goes to Denver. No loose ends. Whitmore's desperation had clearly reached its final stage. Rather than risk the complications of a legal guardianship arrangement, he had decided to eliminate Silent Wolf entirely and claim Mary as her only surviving relative. With the Apache dead and no one else aware of the family connections, Whitmore would have clear access to the mineral rights and no inconvenient witnesses to challenge his claim. The spent cartridge told another story too. One of the hired killers had been practicing, probably behind the buildings where the sound would attract less attention, testing the action of his weapon, checking the sights, preparing for work that required precision rather than speed. This was not a crime of passion, but a calculated execution, planned with the cold efficiency of men who had killed before. Silent Wolf pocketed the cartridge and continued his reconnaissance, moving from shadow to shadow with the fluid grace that had made him legendary among his people. The town seemed smaller now that he viewed it through the lens of impending violence, reduced to tactical considerations of cover and concealment, escape routes and defensive positions. The hotel offered 3 different exits, but only one staircase to the upper floors where Whitmore was staying. The saloon had windows on 2 sides and a back door that opened onto the alley where the horses were tied. The general store commanded a clear view of the main street, but offered no rear exit. Each building was a potential fortress or trap, depending on circumstances and timing. But it was the livery stable that drew his most careful attention. Tom Bradley, the stableman, was shoeing a horse near the main doors, his massive frame bent over the animal's hoof, with the concentrated focus that such work required. Bradley was one of the few men in Copper Creek who had ever shown Silent Wolf basic human courtesy, perhaps because his own scarred face marked him as someone who had experienced the kind of violence that taught empathy. "Afternoon, Wolf," Bradley said without looking up from his work. "Heard there might be trouble heading your way." "What kind of trouble?" "The kind that rides into town asking questions about Apache warriors and little girls. The kind that pays gold coins for information and doesn't much care whether the information is accurate." Bradley straightened, wiping sweat from his forehead with a massive forearm. "Word is they're planning something for tonight after most folks have gone to bed." Silent Wolf felt no surprise at the confirmation of his suspicion. Men like Whitmore's associates preferred to work in darkness, when fewer witnesses were awake, and the sound of gunfire might be attributed to drunken celebration or settling of accounts. They asked about your habits, Bradley continued. When you come to town, what routes you take, whether you carry weapons. I told them I minded my own business and suggested they do the same. Appreciate the warning. Bradley nodded and returned to his work, but his next words carried the weight of someone who had seen too much violence in his lifetime. Whatever you're planning, Wolf, remember that some fights don't end when the shooting stops. Some fights follow a man for the rest of his life. Silent Wolf left the livery stable with new understanding of the dangers that surrounded him. The killers were not simply planning to murder him, they were gathering intelligence, preparing for a hunt that would leave no room for escape or survival. Tonight, when darkness provided cover for their work, they would come for him with professional efficiency and overwhelming force. The only question was whether he would be waiting for them. The hair braid was almost finished when Mary spoke her first word. Silent Wolf had been teaching her the traditional Apache way of weaving grass and sinew, his patient hands guiding her small fingers through the intricate pattern his own grandmother had taught him decades ago. The work was meditative, requiring focus that pushed away fear and uncertainty, replacing them with the calm concentration that came from creating something beautiful. "They want to hurt you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, but clear as a bell in the cabin's quiet interior. Silent Wolf's hands stilled on the braid. In the weeks since he had brought her home, Mary had communicated only through gestures, nods, and the occasional shake of her head. Her silence had been so complete that he had begun to wonder if trauma had stolen her voice entirely. Now, hearing her speak, he realized she had been choosing her silence, holding her words until they were truly needed. "Who wants to hurt me?" he asked, gently, not wanting to frighten her back into muteness. "The men with Uncle Charles. I heard them talking when they thought I was sleeping." Mary's fingers continued working the braid with surprising skill, as if the familiar motion gave her courage to speak. "They said they would kill you and take me to a place called Denver." Silent Wolf felt ice form in his chest. The fact that Mary had overheard the killer's plans was disturbing enough, but her calm acceptance of the danger suggested she had lived with such threats before. Children learned to listen from hiding places when their safety depended on advance warning of adult violence. "What else did you hear?" "Uncle Charles owes money to bad men. He said I was worth more than gold, but only if you were dead." Mary looked up from the braid, her eyes holding the kind of ancient sadness that belonged in the face of someone who had lived through war. "He said my papa left me something valuable, but the law says it only belongs to me if I live with Apache people. The mineral rights." Mary understood more about her situation than anyone had realized. While the adults around her had discussed her fate as if she was simply property to be transferred, she had been listening and learning, piecing together the forces that threatened to destroy her life. "Are you afraid?" Silent Wolf asked. Mary considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "I was afraid before you bought me. I was afraid they would sell me to someone who would hurt me, like the others did. But I'm not afraid now." "Why?" "Because you're different from the other men. You move like the wind, quiet and strong, and your eyes are kind, even when you're sad." She held up the completed braid, admiring their shared handiwork. "My mama told me stories about Apache warriors before she died. She said they were the bravest people in the world, that they protected their families no matter what." Silent Wolf accepted the braid, feeling the weight of her trust like a sacred burden. The grass was woven with traditional patterns that carried meaning, symbols for protection, for family bonds, for the continuity of life across generations. Mary had helped create something that connected her to heritage Reese barely understood, but somehow recognized as important. "Your mama was right about Apache warriors," he said, "but she was also right about something else. The bravest people aren't the ones who never feel fear. They're the ones who feel fear and do what's right anyway." Mary nodded as if this made perfect sense to her. "That's why you're going to fight them, isn't it? Even though there are more of them and they have guns." "How do you know I'm going to fight?" Because that's what Apache warriors do. They protect their families. She looked at him with complete confidence, as if the outcome had already been decided by forces beyond human control. "And I'm your family now, aren't I?" The question hit Silent Wolf harder than any physical blow. This child, who had been sold like livestock and threatened with violence, had somehow found the courage to claim him as family. Despite everything she had suffered, she was willing to trust her life to a man who had been cast out by his own people. "Yes," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "you are my family." Mary smiled then, the first genuine smile he had seen from her since the day of the auction. It transformed her face, revealing glimpses of the spirited child she had been before the world had taught her to be afraid. "Then we'll be okay," she said with the absolute certainty that only children possessed, because Apache warriors always protect their families. As evening approached and the shadows lengthened outside the cabin, Silent Wolf found himself drawing strength from Mary's faith in him. She had broken her silence not to beg for safety or express fear, but to warn him of danger and affirm her trust in his ability to overcome it. The hair braid lay between them on the table, a symbol of traditions that connected past and future, a reminder that some bonds were stronger than blood, and some families were chosen rather than born. The medicine bundle had been his grandfather's, passed down through 4 generations of Apache healers and warriors. Silent Wolf had carried it through his exile, one of the few sacred objects the tribal elders had allowed him to keep when they cast him out. Now, as darkness gathered outside the cabin, he opened the worn leather pouch with reverent hands, revealing the herbs and stones that connected him to wisdom, older than memory. "What is that?" Mary asked, watching as he arranged the contents on a blanket spread across the floor. Her voice held curiosity rather than fear, as if she sensed the spiritual significance of what was happening. "Medicine," Silent Wolf replied, though he knew the word carried different meanings in her world than in his. "Not the kind that heals bodies, but the kind that heals spirits and gives strength for difficult times." The bundle contained objects that most white people would dismiss as primitive superstition: stones, worn smooth by generations of handling, bundles of sage and sweetgrass, carved bone tokens, marked with symbols that recorded the wisdom of his ancestors. But Silent Wolf had learned through experience that power took many forms, and the strength that came from spiritual preparation was as real as the strength that came from physical training. He began with the purification ritual, lighting a braid of sweetgrass and letting the smoke wash over both himself and Mary. The familiar scent carried him back to childhood memories of his grandfather, preparing for hunts, for war councils, for moments when the spirit world needed to be consulted. The smoke was said to carry prayers to the ancestors, to cleanse the mind of doubt and fear, to open pathways between the seen and unseen worlds. "My grandfather taught me that every warrior carries 2 kinds of weapons," Silent Wolf said as he worked. "The ones made of wood and metal and stone, and the ones made of knowledge and wisdom and spiritual strength. Tonight, I'll need both kinds." Mary watched intently as he selected specific stones from the bundle, each one chosen for its particular medicine. The red jasper for courage, the black obsidian for protection against evil, the white quartz for clarity of purpose. These were not random objects, but tools refined by centuries of Apache spiritual practice, each one a repository of power accumulated through ritual use and sacred intention. "My mama used to say prayers before my papa went hunting," Mary said softly. "She said God would keep him safe if we asked with pure hearts." "Your mama was wise," Silent Wolf replied. "All prayers go to the same place, even if we use different words to send them there." He began to prepare war paint, using pigments from the bundle, mixed with water blessed by moonlight. The designs were specific to his family lineage: lightning bolts for speed, eagle feathers for keen sight, bear claws for fierce courage in battle. Each symbol carried meaning that transcended mere decoration, marking him as a warrior who fought not for personal glory, but for protection of those who could not protect themselves. "Will the paint make you stronger?" Mary asked. "The paint reminds me who I am," Silent Wolf answered. "When a man forgets his true nature, he becomes weak. When he remembers it, he becomes dangerous to his enemies." The ritual continued with the selection of weapons, each one blessed with sage smoke and marked with symbols of power. His knife, inherited from his grandfather, received special attention. The blade had been forged from meteoric iron, metal that had fallen from the sky and was therefore touched by spiritual forces. It had drawn blood in defense of the innocent for 4 generations, and tonight it would do so again. Mary surprised him by producing her wooden doll and setting it carefully beside the medicine bundle. "Can you bless this too? It was my mama's when she was little, and she gave it to me before she died. Maybe it has medicine in it." Silent Wolf examined the carved figure with new respect. The workmanship was clearly white, but there were subtle details, the way the hair was arranged, the pattern of the simple dress, that suggested Apache influence. This doll might indeed carry medicine, the kind that came from love, passed between generations, from a mother's desire to connect her daughter to heritage that transcended cultural boundaries. He touched the doll with sage smoke and spoke a prayer in Apache, asking his ancestors to watch over this child who carried their blood, to give her strength for the trials ahead, to surround her with protective spirits that would keep her safe when physical protection failed. "There," he said, returning the doll to Mary's arms. "Now it carries the medicine of both our people." As the night deepened, Silent Wolf completed his spiritual preparations with a prayer of gratitude. Thanks for the opportunity to protect innocence, for the chance to redeem past failures, for the privilege of standing between evil and those who could not defend themselves. The ancestors might have cast him out of tribal society, but they had never abandoned him entirely. Tonight he would draw on their strength as well as his own. The medicine bundle was carefully rewrapped and secured to his belt, its power now activated and ready to support him in battle. But the true medicine, Silent Wolf realized, was sitting across from him, clutching her blessed doll, a child who had given him reason to remember what it meant to be Apache. The hunting knife felt alive in Silent Wolf's hand as he tested its edge against a strip of leather. The blade, forged from meteoric iron by his grandfather's grandfather, held a razor sharpness that seemed to defy the laws of ordinary metal. 4 generations of Apache warriors had carried this weapon into battle, and tonight it would taste blood again in defense of family honor. Silent Wolf had chosen the battleground carefully, using terrain knowledge that went deeper than maps or surveys. The ravine behind his cabin offered natural advantages, limited approaches, good cover, places where a single warrior could hold off multiple attackers if he understood how to use the landscape as an ally. But victory would require more than favorable ground. It would require the kind of tactical thinking that his grandfather had spent years teaching him. "They'll come in the dark hour before dawn," he told Mary as he prepared his weapons. "That's when most men sleep deepest, when guards grow careless and attention wanders. Professional killers know that darkness is their greatest advantage." Mary sat on her blanket, clutching the blessed wooden doll, watching his preparations with the intense focus of someone trying to memorize every detail. She had insisted on staying awake, claiming that she needed to help however she could. Silent Wolf had tried to convince her to hide in the root cellar, but she had refused with the quiet stubbornness that reminded him powerfully of her Apache heritage. "What do you need me to do?" she asked. "Stay alive," Silent Wolf replied. "Whatever happens tonight, your job is to survive so that their evil doesn't win." He had already prepared multiple defensive positions throughout the cabin and the surrounding woods. Caches of weapons hidden at strategic points, escape routes marked with subtle signs that only he could read, traps designed to channel attacking enemies into killing zones where superior numbers would become a disadvantage rather than an asset. The Apache way of warfare had always emphasized intelligence over brute force, mobility over static defense. His grandfather had taught him that a smart warrior never fought fair. He chose when and where and how battles were fought, using every possible advantage to ensure that he survived while his enemies did not. Tonight, Silent Wolf would put those lessons to their ultimate test. From his position at the cabin window, he could see the lights of Copper Creek twinkling in the distance. Most of the town slept peacefully, unaware that professional killers stalked their streets, unaware that violence was about to be unleashed in their peaceful valley. Sheriff Dalton would wake tomorrow to find either a dead Apache warrior or a problem that had mysteriously solved itself. Either outcome would suit his purposes perfectly. The night sounds told their own story to ears trained in wilderness survival. An owl calling from the ridge above the cabin, its voice carrying the news that strangers moved through the forest. A pack of coyotes falling silent in the draw to the east, their conversation interrupted by human scent carried on the wind. The subtle changes in insect chorus that marked the passage of men who didn't understand how to move without disturbing the natural world. "They're coming," Silent Wolf said quietly. Mary nodded and crawled to the position he had prepared for her, a space between the cabin's thick log walls and the stone chimney protected by barriers that would stop bullets but allow her to escape through a concealed opening if the worst happened. She clutched her doll tighter, but showed no signs of panic. The trust in her eyes was absolute. The faith of a child who believed completely in her protector's ability to overcome impossible odds. Silent Wolf checked his weapons one final time. The meteoric knife at his belt, a repeating rifle he had purchased with his mining wages, a bow made from mountain ash and strung with sinew from elk he had killed himself. Traditional weapons and modern ones, Apache skills and white man's technology, everything his mixed heritage had taught him about the art of survival. The first shadow moved past the east window, visible for just an instant before melting back into dark. Professional work, the kind of coordinated movement that spoke of military training and extensive experience. These men had killed before, probably many times, and they approached their work with the calm efficiency of craftsmen practicing a familiar trade. But they had never hunted an Apache warrior on ground of his own choosing, had never faced someone who understood that warfare was not just about weapons and tactics, but about spiritual preparation and ancestral guidance. They saw only a lone Indian standing between them and easy money. They had no idea they were walking into the den of a predator whose people had been perfecting the art of warfare since before their grandfathers were born. Silent Wolf touched the medicine bundle at his belt, drawing strength from the connection to generations of warriors who had faced impossible odds and survived through courage, skill, and the unshakable knowledge that some things were worth dying for. The hunting knife whispered against leather as he drew it from its sheath, ready to write the final chapter of this story in blood and moonlight. The eagle feather bound to Silent Wolf's hair caught the moonlight as he slipped from the cabin's rear window into the waiting darkness. Sacred plumage earned through Vision Quest, blessed by medicine men, worn only when a warrior accepted the possibility that he might not see another sunrise. Tonight it marked his return to what he had always been beneath the exile and shame, a protector of the innocent, a guardian standing between evil and those who could not defend themselves. The first killer died without making a sound. Silent Wolf had tracked him through the pine trees using skills learned in childhood, moving like smoke through shadows, reading the man's location through disturbed leaves and broken twigs. The meteoric knife found its mark between ribs, piercing heart with the precision his grandfather had drilled into him through countless hours of practice. The killer's surprised grunt was lost in the wind through the branches. 4 remained. Silent Wolf could hear them communicating through hand signals and soft whistles, professional techniques for coordinating movement in darkness. But they had made the mistake of thinking like white soldiers rather than thinking like hunters. They moved in formation, maintained predetermined positions, followed tactical doctrines that assumed their enemy would behave predictably. They had never faced an Apache warrior who treated warfare as a fluid dance between predator and prey. The second man fell to an arrow shot from 60 yards, the shaft taking him through the throat as he tried to circle behind the cabin. Silent Wolf had positioned himself in a tree, using elevation and concealment to create angles of attack that his enemies couldn't anticipate. The bow was silent, deadly, and allowed him to strike without revealing his position to the remaining killers. 3 now. Growing nervous, beginning to understand that they were hunting something more dangerous than they had been told to expect, Silent Wolf heard them calling to each other in urgent whispers, trying to regroup and establish communication with their fallen comrades. The plan had been simple: surround the cabin, kill the Apache, take the girl. Professional work conducted with overwhelming force against a single opponent. Now they found themselves being stalked by an enemy who seemed to materialize from shadows, strike without warning, and disappear back into darkness like a vengeful spirit. The third killer made the mistake of seeking higher ground, climbing onto the cabin's roof to gain a better view of the surrounding terrain. Silent Wolf had anticipated this move and prepared accordingly. The man's weight on the weak section of roof triggered the carefully arranged collapse that sent him crashing through into the cabin below, where a sharpened stake waited to receive him. His scream echoed across the valley before cutting off abruptly. 2 left, and these were the most dangerous. The survivors would be the smartest, the most experienced, the ones who understood that their mission had become a fight for survival rather than a simple execution. They would adapt their tactics, abandon their original plan, and become truly unpredictable in their desperation. Silent Wolf touched the eagle feather again, drawing strength from its spiritual significance. In Apache tradition, eagles were messengers between the physical and spirit worlds, carrying prayers to ancestors and bringing their wisdom back to guide the living. Tonight he felt the presence of his grandfather's spirit, offering guidance through instincts sharpened by generations of warfare. A rifle shot shattered the silence, the bullet splintering bark inches from Silent Wolf's head. One of the survivors had spotted his movement and opened fire, abandoning stealth for direct assault. The muzzle flash revealed the shooter's position, crouched behind a fallen log 40 yards from the cabin, using good cover and demonstrating impressive marksmanship, despite the difficult conditions. Silent Wolf rolled behind a boulder as a second shot rang out, this one from a different direction. The remaining killers had separated, trying to pin him between crossfire that would leave him no room for maneuver. Sound tactics, the kind of coordinated assault that had probably worked against other targets. But they still thought like soldiers, still relied on superior firepower rather than superior cunning. The Apache warrior became the shadow again, slipping between their positions like water flowing around stones. His movements were guided by knowledge that went deeper than training, the understanding of landscape that came from growing up in harmony with wild places, the ability to read wind and darkness and the subtle signs that revealed where enemies waited in ambush. When he struck again, it was with the meteoric knife, emerging from undergrowth to take the fourth killer from behind. The blade found its mark with the certainty of ancestral guidance, ending another threat to the child who had become his family. Only one remained now, and Silent Wolf could hear him moving through the forest, no longer hunting but fleeing, recognizing that he had become the prey in a contest he could not win. The eagle feather stirred in the night breeze, carrying the prayers of a warrior who had remembered his true purpose through the crucible of necessary violence. Dawn found Silent Wolf sitting beside the cabin's stone chimney, pressing a blood-stained bandage against the wound in his shoulder, where the last killer's bullet had found its mark. The bleeding had slowed but not stopped, and each movement sent fire through his arm and down his back. The final confrontation had been costly, though not as costly as it might have been. Mary knelt beside him, her small hands surprisingly steady as she helped change the makeshift dressing. Her wooden doll lay forgotten on the ground nearby, abandoned in favor of more pressing concerns. The child, who had been too traumatized to speak just days ago, was now tending battle wounds, with the calm competence of someone far older than her years. "Does it hurt very much?" she asked, her voice soft but steady. "Pain lets you know you're still alive," Silent Wolf replied, though the wound throbbed with each heartbeat, and his vision occasionally blurred from blood loss. Apache warriors learned to welcome pain as a teacher. The last killer had proven more resourceful than his companion. Rather than fleeing in panic, he had circled back toward the cabin, correctly guessing that Silent Wolf would return to check on Mary's safety. The ambush had been well planned and expertly executed, catching the Apache warrior in the open ground between the forest and the cabin door. But Apache training ran deeper than individual tactics. Even wounded and caught by surprise, Silent Wolf had moved with the fluid grace his grandfather had drilled into him through years of practice. The killer's shot had been true enough to draw blood, but not true enough to stop the meteoric knife that answered it. The man now lay still beneath the pine trees, his mission incomplete and his employer abandoned. "What about Uncle Charles?" Mary asked, pressing fresh cloth against the wound with gentle pressure. "He'll know his men failed when they don't come back." Silent Wolf had been thinking about Charles Whitmore since the shooting stopped. The man was desperate enough to hire killers, but cowardly enough to let others do his dangerous work. Now, with his assassins dead and his scheme exposed, Whitmore faced a terrible choice: flee and abandon his claim to the mineral rights, or double down on violence and risk everything in a final gamble. "He'll run," Silent Wolf said, though he wasn't entirely certain. "Men like your uncle prefer easy money to honest work. When things become difficult, they usually choose the path that requires the least courage." Mary finished tying off the bandage with surprising skill, her movements suggesting previous experience with wounds and medical care. Silent Wolf wondered what kind of life she had lived before the auction. What circumstances had taught a child to tend injuries with such practiced competence? "My papa taught me how to wrap cuts," she said, as if reading his thoughts. "He said frontier families needed to know how to take care of each other because doctors were scarce and help was far away." The mention of her father brought back memories of the daguerreotype Whitmore had shown them, the young cavalry officer who had loved an Apache woman enough to abandon his military career. James Whitmore had been a man of principle, whatever his other flaws, and his daughter was proving to have inherited that strength of character. "You did well during the fighting," Silent Wolf told her. "You stayed hidden, stayed quiet, stayed safe. Your papa would have been proud of your courage." "I wasn't very brave," Mary said, settling back on her heels. "I was scared the whole time. Every gunshot made me want to run and hide." "Being brave doesn't mean not being scared. It means doing what needs to be done even when you're terrified. Tonight, you helped save both our lives by staying calm when everything was dangerous." The sound of approaching horses interrupted their conversation. Silent Wolf reached for his rifle, though the movement sent fresh waves of pain through his wounded shoulder. But these riders announced themselves with calls rather than stealth, and the voice that carried across the morning air belonged to Tom Bradley from the livery stable. "Wolf, you and the girl all right over there?" "We're alive," Silent Wolf called back, though he wasn't sure how much longer that would remain true if he didn't get proper medical attention soon. Bradley rode into the clearing, accompanied by 3 other men Silent Wolf recognized from town: the blacksmith, the telegraph operator, and, surprisingly, Reverend Morrison. All of them carried rifles, and their faces showed the grim determination of men who had decided to take sides in a conflict they might not fully understand. "Heard shooting," Bradley said, dismounting and surveying the aftermath of the battle. "Figured you might need help cleaning up whatever trouble found its way to your door." The blood-stained bandage on Silent Wolf's shoulder told part of the story, but the bodies scattered through the forest would tell the rest. 4 dead men, all of them strangers to Copper Creek, all of them carrying the kind of weapons and equipment that suggested professional violence rather than local dispute. "Whitmore's men?" Bradley asked. Silent Wolf nodded, conserving strength for what he suspected would be a long day of explanations and consequences. The battle was over, but the war for Mary's future was just beginning. The wanted poster bore Silent Wolf's likeness, sketched in crude but recognizable detail, offering a $500 reward for his capture on charges of murder, kidnapping, and destruction of property. Sheriff Dalton had wasted no time in transforming the Apache warrior from victim of an assassination attempt into a dangerous fugitive wanted by territorial law. Tom Bradley brought the poster to the cabin, along with news that made Silent Wolf's blood run cold. Federal marshals were already en route from Denver, summoned by urgent telegrams that painted the situation as an Indian uprising requiring immediate and overwhelming response. Whitmore had played his final card with devastating effectiveness, using his political connections to turn the machinery of law enforcement against the man who had thwarted his scheme. "You've got maybe 6 hours before they arrive," Bradley said, his weathered face grim with concern. "After that, this whole valley will be crawling with lawmen who shoot first and ask questions later. They're not coming here to make arrests, they're coming to make examples." Silent Wolf studied the poster with bitter recognition. The sketch captured his features accurately enough to ensure recognition, but the description beneath painted him as a savage who had murdered innocent businessmen and stolen a white child for purposes too dark to contemplate. Truth had been twisted into propaganda, justice perverted into persecution. "What about the bodies?" Silent Wolf asked. "Don't they prove these men came here to kill us?" "Bodies tell whatever story the authorities want them to tell," Bradley replied. "Whitmore's claiming his associates came here to negotiate peacefully for the child's return, and you ambushed them without provocation. He's got witnesses who'll swear to whatever version of events serves his purpose." Mary sat in the corner, clutching her wooden doll, her face pale with the understanding that their brief moment of safety had been shattered. The brave child who had tended Silent Wolf's wounds with steady hands now looked fragile again, overwhelmed by forces too large and complex for anyone to control. "Where can we go?" she asked quietly. Silent Wolf had been asking himself the same question since Bradley arrived with the poster. The territorial justice system was completely corrupted by Whitmore's influence. Local law enforcement was actively hostile, and federal authorities were approaching with orders to use lethal force. Every door that might have offered sanctuary had been closed by money and political pressure. "Apache country," he said finally. "The reservation lands where tribal law still carries weight, where federal marshals have to tread carefully because of treaty obligations. That's 100 miles through hostile territory," Bradley pointed out. "Mountains, desert, rivers swollen with spring runoff. And you're traveling with a wounded shoulder and a child who's never been outside a settlement." "It's our only chance," Silent Wolf replied. "Here, we're already dead. Out there, we at least have a fighting chance." Bradley nodded reluctantly, recognizing the logic, even as he doubted their ability to survive such a journey. "I can give you supplies, a good horse, maybe a 6-hour head start, before anyone notices you're gone. After that, you're on your own." The next hour passed in frantic preparation. Silent Wolf gathered the essential items they would need for wilderness survival: his weapons, the medicine bundle, dried food, blankets, tools for making fire and shelter. Mary packed her few possessions in a small bundle, saying goodbye to the cabin that had been the first real home she had known since her parents' death. "Will we ever come back?" she asked as Silent Wolf helped her onto the horse Bradley had provided. "I don't know," he answered honestly. "But wherever we go, we'll go together. That's what family means, staying together no matter what." The horse was a sturdy mare, with the kind of endurance that would be essential for the journey ahead. Bradley had chosen well, selecting an animal that could carry double weight across difficult terrain without breaking down under the strain. Silent Wolf checked the saddle one final time, ensuring that their supplies were properly secured and that Mary was positioned safely for the long ride ahead. "There's a trading post at Willow Creek," Bradley said, handing Silent Wolf a hand-drawn map. "Old Pete Sullivan runs it. No relation to you despite the name. He's got no love for federal authorities and less love for men who prey on children. If you can make it that far, he might be able to help." Silent Wolf studied the map, memorizing the landmarks and calculating distances. 50 miles to Willow Creek, through country that would test every survival skill his grandfather had taught him. Another 50 miles beyond that to the relative safety of Apache lands, 100 miles that might as well be 1,000, given the forces arrayed against them. The wanted poster fluttered in the morning breeze, a piece of paper that had transformed them from a family seeking safety into fugitives running for their lives. But Silent Wolf had learned long ago that paper meant nothing compared to the bonds forged in blood and sacrifice, that legal documents carried no weight against the deeper laws that governed loyalty and love. As they rode away from the cabin into the wilderness beyond, the poster remained nailed to the door, a testament to corruption that would stand long after its subjects had disappeared into legend. The compass rose engraved on the silver instrument caught the afternoon sun as Silent Wolf checked their bearing for the third time in an hour. The navigation tool had belonged to a cavalry officer whose body he'd found beside a dried riverbed, victim of exposure rather than violence. Now it guided their desperate flight toward Apache territory, its steady needle pointing toward a freedom that seemed as distant as the stars. They had been riding for 2 days through country that tested every survival skill Silent Wolf possessed. Mary sat behind him on the mare, her small arms wrapped around his waist, her body swaying with the horse's movement in a rhythm that spoke of natural horsemanship inherited from her Apache bloodline. The wooden doll remained securely tucked in her bundle, a connection to stability in a world that had become nothing but motion and uncertainty. The wound in Silent Wolf's shoulder had stopped bleeding but remained a constant source of pain and weakness. Each mile of rough terrain sent fresh fire through his arm, and he found himself having to rest more frequently than he would have liked. But the alternative was capture by federal marshals, who carried orders to shoot on sight, and that possibility drove him forward, despite the physical cost. "How much farther?" Mary asked, her voice hoarse from the dust and dry wind that had plagued them since leaving the mountains. 20 miles to Willow Creek, Silent Wolf replied, though he knew the distance might as well be 200, given their current condition. The mare was showing signs of exhaustion, her pace slowing despite his efforts to conserve her strength. They would need to rest soon, find water and forage, allow both horse and riders to recover from the brutal pace they had maintained. Behind them, somewhere in the broken country they had traversed, federal marshals followed their trail with the methodical persistence of professional manhunters. Silent Wolf had done everything possible to conceal their passage, riding through streams to break their scent trail, choosing rocky ground that wouldn't hold hoofprints, even backtracking through difficult terrain to confuse their pursuers. But he knew that determined trackers would eventually pick up their trail again. The landscape around them told the story of their journey toward home. The pine forests of the white settlements had given way to scrub oak and juniper, then to the sage and desert grass of the high country. Each mile brought them closer to the harsh, beautiful land where his people had learned to thrive, where Apache knowledge gave advantages that white lawmen couldn't match. "Look," Mary said, pointing toward a line of cottonwood trees in the distance. "Water." Silent Wolf felt a surge of relief at the sight. They had been rationing their water carefully, but the hot sun and constant travel had drained their reserves faster than anticipated. The creek bed ahead would provide not just water, but also concealment and the possibility of game to supplement their dwindling food supplies. As they approached the water, Silent Wolf's trained eyes read the signs that revealed recent human activity. Horseshoe prints in the mud near the bank, a cold fire ring partially concealed among the rocks, empty tin cans that spoke of men who lived from supplies rather than from the land. Someone had camped here within the last day, and that someone had been traveling light and fast. "Stay on the horse," Silent Wolf instructed Mary as he dismounted to examine the tracks more closely. The prince told a story that chilled him, 4 horses, all shod with military precision, carrying riders who knew how to move quickly through difficult country. The marshals had found their trail and were closing the distance faster than he had hoped. The compass rose gleamed in his palm as he calculated distances and travel times. If the lawmen had camped here last night, they were probably no more than 6 hours behind, maybe less. The mare needed rest and water, but they couldn't afford to stay long enough for proper recovery. They would have to push on toward Willow Creek and hope that the horse's strength lasted long enough to reach sanctuary. Mary filled their water bottles while Silent Wolf studied the terrain ahead. The country was becoming more familiar now, showing the harsh beauty of the borderlands between white settlements and Apache territory. Red rock formations rose like ancient fortresses from the desert floor, and in the distance, the blue shadows of mountains promised refuge for those strong enough to reach them. "Are we almost home?" Mary asked as they prepared to continue their journey. Silent Wolf looked at her, this brave child who had never seen Apache country but somehow recognized it as the place where she belonged, and felt something settle in his chest that had been restless for 5 years of exile. "Yes," he said, helping her back onto the mare. "We're almost home." The compass rose caught the light one final time as he secured it in his pocket, its steady needle pointing toward a future that remained uncertain but no longer impossible. The peace pipe passed slowly around the circle of elders, each man drawing thoughtfully on the sacred tobacco while considering the case that had been brought before them. Silent Wolf sat in the center of the circle, Mary beside him clutching her wooden doll, both of them waiting for judgment that would determine whether they had found sanctuary or simply delayed their capture by federal authorities. Chief Joseph Ironbear, eldest of the tribal council, held the pipe with hands that bore the scars of 60 years of warfare and survival. His weathered face revealed nothing of his thoughts as he studied the man who had once been cast out for bringing dishonor to their people. The silence stretched like a bowstring, heavy with the weight of old wounds and the possibility of redemption. "You were exiled for allowing grief to turn you into a killer of fleeing enemies," Ironbear said finally, his voice carrying the authority of absolute leadership. "You brought shame to our warrior traditions by striking down men who had surrendered their weapons and run from battle." Silent Wolf accepted the condemnation without protest. The facts were not in dispute, and Apache justice required acknowledgement of truth before healing could begin. He had violated the warrior's code that distinguished between honorable combat and revenge killing, and his people had been right to cast him out for that violation. "But now you return with a child of our blood," Ironbear continued, his eyes moving to Mary with something that might have been recognition. A granddaughter of Evening Star, carrying the lineage of those who died at Canyon de Chelly. The mention of his mother's name sent a shiver through Silent Wolf. Evening Star had been beloved by the tribe, remembered not just for her beauty, but for her wisdom and skill as a healer. The knowledge that Mary carried that bloodline gave weight to their claim for sanctuary that mere familial relationship could not provide. Mary looked up at the chief with eyes that held no fear, only the kind of curiosity that came from recognizing kinship across cultural boundaries. She had adapted to Apache life with surprising ease during their 3 days in the village, learning words in the ancient language, participating in daily activities with the eager interest of someone discovering her heritage for the first time. "The white authorities claim this man is a kidnapper and murderer," said another elder, his voice skeptical but not hostile. "They demand his surrender and the return of the child to their jurisdiction." "The white authorities lie," Silent Wolf replied simply. "They serve the interests of a corrupt man who would steal this child's inheritance and destroy her spirit to enrich himself." Ironbear drew on the peace pipe again, the sweet smoke carrying prayers to ancestors whose wisdom was needed for this difficult decision. The choice before the tribal council was not just about Silent Wolf and Mary. It was about the relationship between Apache law and white justice, about whether traditional sanctuary could still protect the innocent in a world increasingly dominated by federal power. "Tell us why we should risk war with the federal government for a man who brought shame to our people," Ironbear said. Silent Wolf rose to his feet, feeling the weight of every eye in the circle. This was his moment to speak truth that could either redeem his past or confirm his permanent exile from the only family he had ever known. "Because I have learned the difference between revenge and protection," he said, "because I understand now that a warrior's true strength comes not from the enemies he kills, but from the innocent lives he saves. Because this child has taught me that honor is not about perfection, but about choosing to do what is right, even when the cost is everything you have." He reached into his medicine bundle and withdrew the broken arrow shaft he had carried for 5 years, holding it up so all could see the blood-stained wood that had become his constant reminder of failure and loss. "I have carried this arrow since the day I fell from grace," he said. "It belonged to a boy who died protecting his grandmother while I was hunting elk in the mountains. For 5 years it has reminded me of my failure to be where I was needed when my people faced their greatest danger." Silent Wolf walked to the fire burning in the center of the circle and held the arrow shaft over the flames. The wood caught quickly, burning with surprising brightness, as if it had been waiting years for this moment of release. "I release my claim to past glory and accept responsibility for past failures," he said as the shaft crumbled to ash. "I ask not for forgiveness, but for the chance to prove that exile has taught me wisdom that I lacked as a young warrior." Mary stood and walked to his side, her small hand finding his scarred fingers. The gesture spoke louder than any words about the bond that had been forged between them, about the kind of family that transcended blood and law, and the bitter divisions between their two worlds. Iron Bear watched the last of the arrow shaft burn to nothing, then looked long and hard at the man and child who stood before him, seeking sanctuary. When he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of final judgment. "The council will deliberate until sunset. Until then, you remain under our protection." The adoption beads caught the firelight as Grandmother Stonecrow worked them into the intricate pattern that would mark Mary's formal acceptance into the Apache nation. Each bead had been chosen for its specific meaning: turquoise for protection, white shell for purity of spirit, black jet for the strength to endure hardship. Together they formed a necklace that would proclaim to all who saw it that this child belonged to the people, that she carried the blood of Evening Star and the blessing of the tribal council. Mary sat perfectly still as the old woman worked, her wooden doll resting in her lap, her eyes bright with wonder at the ceremony unfolding around her. The Apache women had welcomed her with a warmth that transcended language barriers, teaching her songs in the ancient tongue, showing her how to weave grass and prepare traditional foods, sharing stories about her grandmother that filled gaps in her understanding of who she was meant to become. "From this day forward, you will be known as Little Star," Chief Iron Bear announced, his voice carrying across the gathered community. "In honor of your grandmother's memory and in recognition of the light you have brought back to one who was lost in darkness." Silent Wolf felt tears sting his eyes as he watched Mary. Little Star bow her head to receive the ceremonial necklace. The tribal council had deliberated until well past sunset before reaching their decision, but when Iron Bear emerged from the council lodge, his words had carried the weight of unanimous agreement. The exile was ended, the child was accepted, and both would be protected by Apache law against any who sought to harm them. The decision had not been reached lightly. Federal marshals had arrived at the reservation boundary that very afternoon, demanding the surrender of the fugitives and threatening military action if their demands were not met. But Iron Bear had met them at the treaty line with 24 armed warriors and the authority of sovereign law, making it clear that Apache territory remained Apache jurisdiction regardless of federal pressure. "The whites may bluster and threaten," Iron Bear had told the marshals, "but they know the cost of violating treaty obligations. They will not risk another Indian war over the lies of one corrupt man." Now, as the ceremony reached its conclusion, Silent Wolf understood that he had found something more valuable than mere sanctuary. He had found redemption through service, healing through protection of innocence, and a path back to the man his grandfather had tried to teach him to become. The broken arrow that had symbolized his failure was gone, replaced by living proof that some wounds could heal if tended with patience and love. Little Star looked up at him with eyes that sparkled with happiness, the adoption beads gleaming against her throat like captured starlight. She was no longer the terrified child from the auction block, but a young Apache woman beginning to understand her place in the continuity of generations. The wooden doll in her hands had been blessed by the medicine women and would serve as a bridge between her white heritage and her Apache future. "Will you teach me to hunt?" she asked, her words mixing English and Apache in the fluid way of children learning new languages. "I will teach you everything," Silent Wolf promised. "How to read the wind and follow tracks, how to find water in the desert and shelter in the mountains, how to honor the ancestors and protect the innocent." The ceremony continued late into the night, with dancing and storytelling that celebrated not just Little Star's adoption, but Silent Wolf's return to the community. The elders spoke of second chances and the wisdom that came from surviving exile, of how the man who had left in shame had returned as a protector of the vulnerable. As the fire burned low and the celebration wound toward its close, Silent Wolf found himself thinking about the journey that had brought them to this moment. From the auction block in Copper Creek to the sacred fire of the Apache, they had traveled not just across physical distance, but across the spaces that separated despair from hope, isolation from belonging, shame from redemption. The federal marshals would return to their superiors with reports of failure, of jurisdiction they could not challenge, and suspects they could not reach. Charles Whitmore would face his creditors alone, His scheme collapsed and his niece forever beyond his reach. Sheriff Dalton would find other scapegoats for the violence that had erupted in his territory. But here, in the heart of Apache country, under stars that had watched over this land for countless generations, a lonely warrior had found his family and a lost child had found her home. The adoption beads would mark little Star as Apache for all the days of her life, just as the memory of her courage would mark Silent Wolf as a protector worthy of his ancestors' pride. The fire settled into glowing embers, and the people began to drift toward their homes, carrying with them the satisfaction of a ceremony properly conducted and a family properly restored. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new tests of courage and wisdom. But tonight, they were complete.